The glass door slammed shut behind him with a smug ding, followed by an icy voice echoing across the marbled floor. "This store is for customers, not costumes. Kindly leave." Gasps erupted from nearby shoppers. The man being addressed didn't flinch. Standing tall in his bearskin hat and crimson uniform, the royal guard simply looked forward, unmoving. But inside, something stirred. Something deeper than pride, older than discipline. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It was an overcast Tuesday on Bond Street, London's most luxurious retail stretch, lined with designer boutiques dripping in gold accents and guarded by velvet ropes. The occasional click of high heels blended with the soft rumble of foreign languages, creating a hum of wealth and exclusivity. Among the high-spending tourists and well-tailored aristocrats, one figure stood out. Not because he was loud, not because he was wealthy, but because he was unmistakably out of place. 27-year-old Jonathan Ashcroft had served in the Royal Guard for nearly a decade. With sharp cheekbones, pale blue eyes, and posture that seemed carved from granite, he represented everything the uniform stood for: honor, control, duty. But today was different. Jonathan wasn't stationed at Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. Today, he was off duty, and yet he wore his uniform, not for spectacle, but for purpose. Just hours earlier, he had received word that a young tourist had lost her grandmother's heirloom brooch while shopping at Leon Marquez, one of the most exclusive jewelers in London. And as it turned out, that brooch bore the insignia of the late Queen's private collection, a royal piece, now missing. And Jonathan had a personal connection to it. His own great-aunt once served in the same royal household where that brooch had last appeared. This wasn't just about duty. It was about heritage. So he walked into Leon Marquez, not as a shopper, but as a guardian of royal history. The store manager, a slick-haired man named Felix Darcy, wasn't impressed. "Excuse me," Felix had sneered, looking Jonathan up and down. "We don't allow performers in uniform to loiter here. You can take your tourist act somewhere else." Several patrons turned, some chuckling behind diamond-studded wrists. One woman whispered, "Is that a real guard? Why is he even here?" Jonathan remained still. Then calmly he replied, "I'm here on official concern. A royal heirloom may have been misplaced within your premises. I'd like to speak with your head of security." Felix laughed, clearly mistaking composure for weakness. "Security?" he echoed mockingly. "You're in our space now, soldier. Unless you've got a black card or a runway invite, you don't belong." Despite the rising tension, Jonathan's gaze never shifted. He looked beyond Felix, scanning the layout: glass cases, tall mirrors, and a private back area marked "Staff Only." That's where they likely held unclaimed items. "I ask again, sir," Jonathan said with calm steel in his voice. "Allow me to check your lost property records. It could save your reputation." That was the last straw for Felix. He snapped his fingers, summoning 2 store employees. "Escort this man outside. I don't care if he came from Buckingham himself. He doesn't fit the image we curate here." The 2 employees approached cautiously, clearly uneasy. One of them, a young clerk named Amira, looked like she recognized Jonathan's tone. She hesitated. Jonathan, understanding the situation could escalate, simply nodded and turned on his heel to walk out on his own. He didn't resist. He didn't shout. But as the glass door closed behind him, something else happened. A small child who had been watching everything, perhaps 6 years old, holding her mother's hand, looked up at the uniformed man and asked aloud, "Why did they kick out the soldier, Mummy? Didn't he protect the Queen?" The question hit harder than any insult. Outside, Jonathan stood still for a moment, adjusting his gloves, letting the cold breeze settle his thoughts. This wasn't over, not because his pride was wounded, but because something far more important had just clicked into place. He knew now that Leon Marquez had something to hide, and he was going to uncover it. The cold air kissed Jonathan's face as he stood outside the boutique, the automatic glass doors behind him sealing shut with a soft hiss, as though locking away something more sinister than just luxury merchandise. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of centuries-old duty pressing against his chest, not from the ceremonial uniform he wore, but from the invisible thread connecting him to something far greater than himself. He wasn't just a soldier today. He was a guardian of legacy. His fingers tightened around his phone as he walked a few paces down the pavement, away from the curious glances of bystanders. He opened a secure messaging app and quickly typed, "Urgent. Suspected royal artifact inside Leon Marquez. Brooch may be part of the Queen's private legacy. Requesting legal access to surveillance and lost property records." The recipient, a retired military officer turned royal liaison, replied within minutes. "Understood. Wait for clearance. Will initiate formal request. Do not act without approval." But deep inside, Jonathan knew this couldn't wait. Something about Felix, the smug manager, didn't sit right with him. The dismissive arrogance, the refusal to even listen, the way he threw out a royal guard like a street performer. It wasn't just ego, it was fear. Inside the boutique, meanwhile, someone else was dealing with their own internal conflict. Amira Patel, a 24-year-old junior clerk, had watched everything unfold from behind a mirrored display case. At first, like everyone else, she assumed the man in red was a tourist attraction gone rogue. But then he spoke. Calm, composed, articulate. And something about the way he carried himself unsettled her. That wasn't the voice of a performer. It was the voice of a protector. That evening, long after the last customer had left, and the chandeliers above had dimmed to their ambient night mode, Amira lingered near the store's internal records room. She glanced over her shoulder. Felix was in his office, on a call, laughing. With trembling fingers, she opened the digital archive database and searched the lost property intake from the last 5 days. There it was. Antique brooch, gold finish, emblem resembles British royal insignia. The item had been logged in, delivered anonymously, with no follow-up. It hadn't been processed, it hadn't been claimed, and it hadn't been reported. Her heart skipped. Why would a high-value antique with royal markings be quietly hidden in the system, and then ignored? The next morning, Jonathan stood near Bond Street once again, this time in plain clothes. The uniform would draw too much attention, and right now he needed to observe, not confront. From across the street, he watched the shop carefully. Patrons came and went, some with shopping bags the size of suitcases, some barely staying long enough to sip the complimentary champagne. Then, at around noon, he saw her, Amira, emerging from the back of the store, taking out a small trash bag. She paused, glanced around nervously, and looked straight across the street. Their eyes met. She hesitated, then walked toward him slowly. "You're the guard from yesterday," she said, voice low. He nodded. "Jonathan Ashcroft, and I need your help. I found something in the records," she whispered. "A brooch. It matches the description, but it's marked as stored and not in inventory anymore. Do you know where it is now?" he asked gently. She hesitated. "I think Felix moved it. Yesterday, after you left, he took a black velvet box from the back and went into one of the private viewing rooms with a man I didn't recognize." "What did he look like?" Jonathan asked, his voice sharpening just slightly. "Tall, gray suit, expensive, French accent. He came with no appointment. Felix treated him like royalty." Jonathan felt his stomach twist. This wasn't just a missing trinket. This was organized, a black market transaction, and Felix was the middleman. He took out his phone and called Marcus Taylor, a former military intelligence operative who now worked in the Royal Household Security Office. "I've got confirmation," Jonathan said, as he crossed the street to avoid being overheard. "The brooch was here. It was taken into a private showing room, unregistered. There's a pattern here." Marcus's voice was firm. "We'll fast-track legal access. You'll have surveillance and inventory audit authorization within 24 hours. But Jonathan, don't make any moves without us." Jonathan hung up, jaw tight. He wasn't about to break protocol, but neither was he going to let tradition be sold off like yesterday's trinkets. That night, he polished his boots, pressed his uniform, not because he was scheduled for guard duty, but because symbols mattered. And the next morning, he would be standing where everyone could see him, not as a tourist trap, not as a relic, but as a reminder. At 10 a.m. sharp, Jonathan arrived at Léon Marcus in full ceremonial attire. He stood facing the glass facade of the boutique, his back straight, his eyes steady. For a moment, people simply walked by. Some slowed down, some stared. A few took photos, and then Felix saw him. The manager's face contorted behind the crystal-clear storefront. He rushed out, voice already raised before he even crossed the threshold. "I told you yesterday." Jonathan raised a gloved hand. "You don't need to say anything, Mr. Darcy." From the left, Marcus approached, flanked by another officer in civilian dress. They both carried official documents embossed with the royal crest. Felix stopped mid-stride. "What is this?" Marcus handed him the papers. "Per the Royal Heritage Act, we are here to review your security footage, inventory logs, and private showrooms. We've reason to believe a royal artifact has passed through your premises illegally." Felix paled. "This is some kind of mistake?" "No, sir," Marcus said calmly. "The mistake was thinking no one would notice." Jonathan stepped past Felix and entered the boutique. The first time anyone had seen a royal guard voluntarily walk into such an establishment, not as a curiosity, but as a force. Patrons inside froze. Some gasped, others instinctively stepped aside. The store, once full of soft classical music and the clinking of crystal glasses, fell into a dead silence. Jonathan's boots echoed on the marble as he walked straight toward the velvet-curtained corridor that led to the private rooms. Amira was already waiting near the back, holding a small black case. I found this hidden in the drawer in Felix's office," she whispered, her voice shaking. Jonathan took the box and opened it slowly. Inside lay the brooch, delicate gold filigree, a sapphire center, and the unmistakable emblem of the Queen's house. He nodded once. "I know this piece," he said, mostly to himself. "It belonged to Lady Althea, the Queen's personal attendant. It was part of her estate and should never have left royal possession." Marcus examined it and took photos, then turned toward Felix, who stood frozen near the entrance, sweat forming under his collar. "Mr. Darcy," Marcus said, "you'll need to accompany us. We have more questions for you at the Heritage Commission." Felix didn't speak, didn't move, but the damage was done. Jonathan turned toward the glass storefront where a small crowd had begun to gather again. Some were already filming. One child pointed and said, "Look, Mummy, the Royal Guard's a hero." He didn't react, not outwardly. But deep inside, the quiet dignity of that moment settled into something profound. Respect was never demanded. It was earned by action, not appearance. And today, a uniform worn for tradition had defended more than ceremony. It had protected history. The brooch was now safe, tucked into a velvet-lined evidence box under the supervision of Marcus and the Heritage Commission's investigative team. But the damage had already spread beyond the walls of Léon Marquess. What happened inside the boutique that morning didn't stay there. Within hours, photos and videos taken by passers-by began circulating on social media. A royal guard in full uniform, calmly entering a luxury store with agents at his side? The image went viral. Headlines began popping up. Royal Guard takes stand for stolen heritage. Exclusive boutique accused of hiding Queen's brooch. Leon Marquez faces royal investigation after shocking revelation. By late afternoon, BBC and ITV vans were parked a block away, trying to get statements. Felix, once so sure of his position and power, now paced behind frosted glass, his jaw clenched, his hands shaking. Inside the store, tension was high. Staff whispered behind displays. Customers hesitated to walk in. Some turned away the moment they recognized the man pacing inside. Jonathan wasn't present anymore. He'd done his part, but the ripple effect of his action was still unfolding, shaking the boutique's glittering foundation. Back at a discreet office near Whitehall, he sat across from a royal heritage official, reviewing the preliminary report. "It's unbelievable," the official muttered. "A brooch like that doesn't just vanish. And to think it was nearly sold on the private market." Jonathan nodded. Felix wasn't just careless. He was deliberate. He knew what he had. The man sighed. "And thanks to your intervention, we have it back before it left the country." Jonathan's gaze was steady. "But this may be bigger than just one piece." He was right. As investigators combed through the boutique's inventory records and backroom transaction logs, a disturbing pattern emerged. Items with vague descriptions, vintage, unregistered, donation, had been disappearing over the past 2 years. Rare items, antique items, some potentially linked to private aristocratic collections, others possibly even more pieces from the Queen's legacy. And all of it happened under Felix's watch. By the next morning, things came crashing down. Leon Marquez was temporarily closed for inventory review. A sign on the polished glass door explained it in generic terms, but the public wasn't fooled. Protesters began gathering, some holding signs about heritage, others demanding transparency in luxury trade. Tourists posed outside the boutique, pointing at the now infamous building. Media swarmed the area, and in the middle of it all stood Amira. She hadn't expected to become part of the story, but when she was called to testify about what she'd seen and found, she didn't hesitate. She told the truth. How Felix had hidden the brooch, how he'd allowed a mysterious buyer into the viewing room, how he treated Jonathan like a prop instead of an officer. She stood tall in front of the committee. "I didn't know the history behind the brooch," she said, "but I knew we were doing something wrong, and I couldn't stay silent." Jonathan watched from a corner of the room. He didn't speak, but when she finished, he gave her the faintest nod, an acknowledgement, a quiet thank you. Felix, meanwhile, was not handling things so gracefully. When summoned for questioning, he arrived flustered and pale. His expensive suit couldn't hide the sweat on his forehead, nor the quiver in his voice. He tried to deflect blame, claiming he didn't know the brooch's origin, that it had been logged improperly, that staff miscommunication caused the confusion, but the records didn't lie. Neither did Amira. And neither did the man in red who had stood silently, professionally, while being insulted in front of dozens of customers. That moment, Jonathan's dismissal, had been played in slow motion on national news. His stillness, the child's voice. Didn't he protect the Queen? The clip was repeated, analyzed, turned into think pieces about class, duty, and respect. Public sentiment shifted hard and fast. People were outraged that a man who had served the crown was thrown out of a British institution simply because he didn't fit the image. The boutique's Instagram page was flooded with angry comments. Disgraceful. This is what elitism looks like. He guarded the Queen. What have you done, Felix? Shame on you. Leon Marquez's brand, once associated with royalty and high fashion, was now synonymous with scandal and greed. Meanwhile, Jonathan was asked to attend a formal ceremony at Windsor Castle, not in punishment, but in quiet recognition. The Queen Consort herself commended his actions. "You didn't just protect a piece of jewelry," she said. "You protected a memory." Jonathan simply bowed. It was never about the attention. Back on Bond Street, the boutique tried to recover. New management was brought in. A public relations firm was hired. They issued a long apology letter, highlighting their commitment to transparency and heritage preservation. But the public remained skeptical. Felix had vanished from the spotlight, resigned, possibly fired under investigation. Amira, meanwhile, was promoted, not just for her honesty, but for her courage. And Jonathan? He returned to his post. Day after day, in sun or rain, he stood silently in front of the palace gates, his boots polished, his gaze unflinching. Tourists came by in greater numbers now. Some asked for photos, some tried to thank him. He never responded, as protocol demanded. But occasionally, when no one was watching, his eyes would flicker toward the horizon, not searching for trouble, but watching, always, for the next quiet injustice, hiding behind a polished smile. Because for Jonathan Ashcroft, guarding the nation wasn't a job. It was a calling. The summer sun filtered gently through the clouds above Buckingham Palace. The atmosphere was peaceful, ceremonial, and timeless, just as it had always been. Tourists lined up in front of the black iron gates, trying to catch a glimpse of the guards in their red uniforms and towering bearskin hats. Children pressed their noses to the railings. Some held tiny British flags, some just stared in awe, and among them stood Jonathan Ashcroft, unmoved, unbothered, unbroken. But today, something was different. He wasn't just another figure in the line of guards. He was the guard, the one from the story that had captured the heart of a nation. Weeks had passed since the scandal at Leon Marquez exploded into the public consciousness. Felix Darcy, once the face of luxury and elite retail, had been formally charged with willful concealment of cultural property and fraudulent transactions. Investigations revealed he'd been involved in a discreet network of collectors, trafficking rare artifacts behind the polished veneer of respectability. The brooch was just the beginning. More than a dozen items were traced back to questionable private sales, some dating back years. Royal artifacts, war medals, aristocratic heirlooms, each with a history, a story, a soul, all nearly lost to greed. Public opinion had turned fierce. The story wasn't just about a theft anymore. It became a reflection of something deeper. Respect, identity, memory. A national tabloid even ran a front-page spread, "The Guard Who Stood His Ground." Underneath it, Jonathan's photo in full uniform. No smile, no words, just unwavering resolve. Back inside the palace walls, Jonathan had been formally honored. Not with a grand ceremony, but with something more meaningful. A private letter of gratitude signed by the Queen Consort, and a visit to the Royal Archives, where he was shown the restored brooch, now safely back in the royal collection. The archivist placed it gently on a velvet cloth. "Thanks to you, this piece's journey ends where it belongs." Jonathan studied it for a moment. The delicate gold, the sapphire gleam, the legacy. "It never belonged in a velvet box for sale," he said quietly. "It belonged in memory." Meanwhile, Amira was settling into her new role. She'd been offered a position in a government-backed heritage protection task force. She now trained to recognize stolen or forged artifacts in private collections. Her courage had not gone unnoticed. One day, as she walked past the palace gates with her parents, she spotted Jonathan among the guards. Her father whispered, "That's him, isn't it? The Royal Guard?" Amira smiled, eyes filled with quiet pride. "Yes, that's him." She didn't wave. She knew he couldn't break formation. But Jonathan saw her, and he remembered. Far from the limelight, Marcus Taylor continued his work with the Royal Heritage Office, but every time a new report landed on his desk, he thought of Jonathan's words. "Symbols matter, but only if you stand for what they mean." In the weeks that followed, boutique security laws were tightened. Royal and historical artifacts were granted additional protections. New policies were drafted, reviewed, and enforced. The scandal sparked a national conversation about legacy and privilege, class and duty. But Jonathan didn't concern himself with policies. He remained at his post, because that's what he did. One quiet afternoon, a small boy approached the palace railings. He had a toy guard in one hand and his mother's sleeve in the other. "Mum," he whispered, pointing at Jonathan, "is that the real one? The hero?" His mother crouched beside him. "Yes, darling. That's the one who reminded everyone what a real guard does." The boy stood still, eyes wide. Then, lifting his toy guard, he held it up like a salute. Jonathan never flinched, but something in his posture softened. He would never speak of what happened inside Leon Marcus. He would never boast about the media frenzy or the recognition. That wasn't his way. But the story lived on, not because he told it, but because others remembered it. He had protected a piece of history, and in doing so, had become part of it. Respect isn't about wealth, uniforms, or titles. It's about doing the right thing, especially when no one's watching. What would you have done in Jonathan's place? Would you have walked away after being disrespected, or returned to defend something bigger than yourself? Let us know in the comments. If you were moved by this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another tale of courage, honor, and quiet strength.